This is The Doorstep, sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs, featuring Nicholas Gvosdev, Tatiana Serafin, and Tom Nichols.
Welcome to The Doorstep. It's election day, day 2 or day 2002. I can't tell anymore, but we are here today with special guest Tom Nichols, author, professor, and advisor to the Lincoln Project, to help walk us through what this all means, what the world is saying about America, and what's next for America in the world. We bring this to you to help you understand how international news affects your day-to-day life. And welcome again to Tom Nichols and Nick. Let's talk. What are people saying? What's the world saying? I've been looking at some headlines from around the world, some concerned allies in Europe, China kind of ignoring us a little bit, instead focusing on the fact that we left the climate agreement yesterday, which nobody's talking about, kind of a big deal. So what's the world saying? What's on your radar, Nick and Tom?
Well, Tom, let's pass it over to you, because I think you've been one of the great observers of what's happening in our body politic, but also moving beyond just sort of the generic and trying to get an understanding at what's motivating people. And as we say, this is the doorstep. This is one of the few times in which the American doorstep reverses direction. And instead of the world impacting the average American, this is where the average American, by choosing to cast a ballot, by choosing not to cast a ballot, has an impact on what happens in the U.S. and the world. So now that we're 2 days past Election Day, any initial observations or thoughts about what this says about what America is saying to the world?
A few, and I should start by saying, obviously, I don't represent any of the organizations I'm affiliated with, even the Lincoln Project, where I'm just a senior advisor. And of course, all of the other places I teach and work at. So just my own views. But I think what the world's doing right now on day 2000 of the election is, I think they're holding their breath. I think, the climate change issue, for example, I don't think anybody's really thinking about us leaving the climate accord, because I think the assumption is, if Joe Biden is elected, all of that stuff goes away, that we somehow start getting back on track, that these unilateral actions that Donald Trump took, excuse me, will mostly be reversed. This is something that actually those of us that were Trump critics and opponents were actually glad to see that Trump had a real predilection for doing things by executive order, because those are the easiest things to reverse on day one. You simply, with a stroke of your pen, say these executive orders are no longer operative. Trump did not have the patience or the competence to plod his way through making any of his changes lasting, other than being able to get out of treaties, which I think is a big deal. But that was also, again, what happens when you have John Bolton around. And so I think internationally, our friends are holding their breath and hoping that what happened over the past 4 years was a freak accident, was a perfect storm. And I will say that my personal evaluation of the 2016 election was that it was a perfect storm, that it was a freak outcome. For 2 years, I referred to the president as his accidency. The Democrats ran Hillary Clinton. The economy was good. A TV star with high visibility. I think I'm one of the people that think Donald Trump never intended to win the election, and he was as surprised as everybody else when 60 million people turned out to not be in on the joke. And I think in some ways, if he loses, which I think is now practically assured, he's going to be relieved. He didn't want the job, and he doesn't like it. So internationally, I think the Chinese are hunkering down because they want an end to this ridiculous trade war. And I don't think they're looking for a warmer relationship with us. I think they and the Russians both would like a more predictable relationship with us. They would like to know who to talk to, who's authoritative, Who speaks for the administration? If we're going to be enemies, can we at least be enemies in some way that is clearly understood, rather than these, oh, President Xi's a great guy, but the Chinese screwed us, but the China's responsible for the virus and they're going to pay, but I love the Chinese. I think our opponents have shrugged and said, America is, sometimes I think it must be that they look at us, the way we looked at China during the Cultural Revolution or something, and saying something terrible is going on there and we can't figure it out. But of course, we are, as the Canadians always say, it's like sleeping next to an elephant. We roll over and people get crushed. I think our opponents in particular, I think the Russians have been interesting. Two really positive things have happened that have surprised me. One is that the Russians seem to have taken seriously the idea that a full-on assault against our electoral system 2 times in a row was not a good idea. I am surprised at how smoothly the election went. Now, I think some of that, maybe I'm being too optimistic. This could be credit to the NSA and the CIA and a lot of other people who may have forestalled some terrible attacks. But I think the Russians, if the Russians had really wanted to put on a full court press, we would have seen more of it. I also think that the initial reactions from people like Putin, I think our enemies couldn't believe that Donald Trump was president either. And they're almost now kind of prepping themselves for returning to a more normal competitor, frenemy relationship with the United States. And I think that's actually a good thing. I have been worried for 4 years, not so much that Donald Trump would make a policy decision that I would disagree with, as much as I was concerned that our enemies would finally give up on trying to figure out what American policy is and start doing things that then we would end up having to react to. And we would be in a kind of a 1914 situation rather than a, Cold War or 1962 situation. So, so far, I think, everybody's getting used to the idea, at least, knock on wood. This is partly my partisan inclinations talking, but I think everybody is getting used to the idea that this past 48 months was just a bizarre interregnum in American life. And I think even our enemies want to get back to something more like a cooperative and predictable relationship, even if we don't agree about things.
That's so interesting. Although I do think that there has been, as a result of the last 4 years, a decrease in our authority, almost, because we haven't engaged.
No question.
The world has moved on and has been making decisions. I mean, in Europe, we see almost them, looking at us and shrugging because they've had to almost be left on their own to deal with the coronavirus, with Brexit, which nobody really is talking about, but it's happening. And they've kind of moved on. And so, are we going to get kind of left behind, no matter who is in charge?
It's hard to leave behind the biggest economy and the most powerful nation in the world. But part of our soft power has always been to tell the rest of the world, you cannot do without us. You would miss us if we are gone. And the world's gotten a look at what it's like to have the United States AWOL, to have the United States basically vanish from the world stage. And, as you say, it's almost like, okay, it wasn't, we lived with it, we can get by. But I'm not sure that that anybody wanted to see if we could do that for 8 years rather than 4. I do think there's a difference between one presidential term. And let me inject some historical, although I'm a political scientist, I'm an amateur historian of the Cold War, as Nick knows. I don't have those same history chops, but I wrote a book on the Cold War some years ago. And it's always important to remember that in 1975, Gerald Ford had to go to Brussels to plead with NATO to stay together. He literally gives a speech in Brussels that says, America still cares. America's still here. We still matter. Hey, guys. And, you had a prime minister of Great Britain at the time, James Callaghan, who said, my job is to help manage British decline. I started college in the fall of 1979, where it was routine tell young students, I was, I ended up majoring in, Russian studies and stuff like that. It was routine. I took a comparative economics course. Our economy and the Soviet economy will converge. The Soviet model works. The American model doesn't work. America's, Nick, I'm almost going to start doing the speech from Red Dawn. Your forefathers have been betrayed. But that it's important to remember how strong the narrative of American decline was 45 years ago this month, and that we went from, remember that in 1975, and I feel the need to, especially for younger listeners, I really feel the need to point this out. As America went into the 1976 presidential election, we had a president and a vice president who had been elected by nobody. Think of that. Think of all the conspiracy theories in the media, social media age that would happen if Ford and Rockefeller were the president and vice president. You had a president and vice president who had been totally appointed by Congress. We had just been defeated in a major war with communist tanks rolling through Vietnam into Saigon after 55,000 American deaths. The Soviets were publishing crowing articles about the correlation of forces turning in the Soviet favor, and that America was through, that America was done. It's really hard to remember that by 1985, within 9 years, Ronald Reagan won 49 states. NATO had a complete nuclear rearmament. Defense budgets were through the roof. Instead of Callahan and Carter and Schmidt, you had Thatcher and Reagan and Mulroney. We have a tendency to believe that the current moment is all moments. And I think on this, yes, we've proven to the world that we are not indispensable, that Madeleine Albright is wrong. We are not the indispensable, nation, and that things can happen without us. On the other hand, I think that's also shaken some people, and that they want to see us come back. Now, I don't think we could sustain 8 years of that. I think the period from 1970, let's say 1973, from the oil crisis to the end of the Carter administration, was a low point in American power. That could not have gone on for another 4 or 5 years. And I don't think this situation could have gone on for another 4 or 5 years without some kind of a major conflict or a major collapse of American power. But I think we've weathered worse than this. We have actually come back from worse than this with our own allies against our own opponents. If you had told somebody, and I'll get off this historical soapbox, but if you had told someone in 1975 that in 15 years, if you had said in 1975, my prediction is that in 15 years, by 1990, the Soviet Union will have collapsed, and that the United States would be the strongest economic power in the world, that there would be no serious challenger to the capitalist model, that NATO would be on the verge of heading from 15 to 30 nations, et cetera, et cetera, you would have been laughed out of the room as an insane optimist. So I just want to make sure that we're not drawing too many inferences about the permanent damage that's been done to us over 4 years.
Well, and Tom, if I can take your historical soapbox and bring it to the present moment with what we've seen with voters, both voters who cast ballots for Donald Trump, voters who cast ballots for Joe Biden, the mood of the country. Is there a sense, though, again, that, some of the polling data that Carnegie Council has done over the past year, where people say, we believe we're living in the most dangerous times we've ever lived in. We are fearful for the future. The theme that some people have of growing, resentments and this isn't the America that I remember, or that I think I remember, that, no one has ever lived in as bad economic straits as today. Is there a sense that, that we are in a kind of a 1975, 1976 moment, but that was reflected in some of what we've seen in the polls in 2020, that when people are casting ballots, they're casting from more a sense, say, of fear, and that they're transmitting that fear to the rest of the world rather than a sense of confidence.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I find so frustrating about the current American political situation is people are talking the same way they talked as if it were 1975, except that it's not 1975. It's never been so dangerous and this terrible sense of threat and things are awful and my God, and globalization and the economy. These are the things that you can only say if you haven't lived through 1975. I find it astonishing, and the America, America is now the country I didn't grow up in. I just wrote that article yesterday. I just wrote that in the Atlantic like 24 hours ago, that this election does not say anything good about the American people, unfortunately. And I think in that sense, I would go back to the same things that people like Christopher Lasch or other social critics were saying in the late 70s, that America has become decadent, narcissistic, inward looking. Now, with that said, other than maybe 1980 or 1984, when has foreign policy and America's position in the world ever mattered in a presidential election? People just don't vote on that, unfortunately. People like us might vote on that because we work for national security and foreign policy related institutions. But, people in Indiana and Texas and New Hampshire are not voting on NATO and what they think our position in the world is. And that's always been a problem. I think what the Trump era did was that nativism and isolationism and pessimism. Trump was the first time we ever externalized that into a president. And I think that was the thing that shook a lot of the world's confidence. The one thing, to go back to our earlier conversation about, the lasting damage, the thing that I really worry about more than anything is that not that America is permanently knocked out of the box as a great power or any of that stuff. It's that we've proven we're capable of doing something this crazy. Like, the rest of the world could always look at the America Firsters or the Taft isolationists or the anti-institute. They could say, yeah, there's a streak of crazy in America, but the Americans are always like Churchill, right? The Americans are always going to do the right thing after they've exhausted all the other possibilities. They're a sturdy, sensible people. Hannah Arendt, I think sometime in the 50s, I want to say Arendt, and I can't remember the provenance of this quote, I'm sorry, but Arendt said something like, the Americans have a political maturity not found anywhere else in the world with the possible exception of Scandinavia. There was once a time where you could actually talk about the remarkable stoicism and political maturity of the American people. I think that is gone. And I don't know whether it will come back. I'm writing a book right now where I argue for this, and I say that, American stoicism is a virtue that we need to rediscover. But we had never shown the rest of the world that we are capable of doing something so stupid and crazy as electing a complete nativist ignoramus to the presidency. Our institutions of government had always somehow managed to screen that out. And now we've proven it's, I always, during the 4 years of the Trump administration, I always likened it to being in a relationship or with a significant other that may have been stormy, but they had never hit you. And the first time they hit you, you can't ever unring that bell and say, even if they never do it again, it happened once, it's there now, it's out there now. And I think for our allies around the world, we're the spouse that has finally hit them, and now they're looking at us and saying, boy, I hope that was just I hope that was like a really stupid emotional moment, and that you're not actually that kind of a partner. So that I'm worried about that. I'm worried that we kind of broke our political vow here, never to do something this crazy. With that said, we're on the verge of electing one of the most solidly liberal internationalist, institutionalist, alliance-oriented, old-school Democrats, former head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So if we were going to ever try to soothe that wound, Joe Biden is, the most obvious choice for that.
Speaking of Joe Biden, since you bring him up, and I think I've been refreshing my browser every 2 minutes to see if Nevada's come in yet. But
do you know something?
I don't think so. I haven't seen anything. But who do you think? Secretary of State? He put up his transition website yesterday, and so now we're all talking in the news biz. Like, okay, who? Throwing out names. Anybody come to mind, and any particular next day changes in policy that we might see?
Yes and no. One of the things that has really impressed me about the Biden campaign was the immense amount of discipline in the Biden campaign, including message discipline. And I think insofar as Biden is having trouble in this election, and that Democrats who are being beaten for House and Senate seats, it's that Biden had a huge amount of message discipline and the Democratic Party didn't. And part of that message discipline was that Biden absolutely refused to entertain any of these speculations about future cabinets and, like the Susan Rice bubble for VP. That drove me crazy. That drove me absolutely crazy. I mean, Susan Rice, you have to be not only within the Beltway, you have to literally be like within Route 50 in Washington to even think of that, And Biden, to his credit, just kind of waved it all away. I wasn't crazy about Kamala Harris as a pick. I figured it was a do no harm, kind of keep the ship stable kind of pick. But the flip side of that is we don't know a lot about Biden's future team. I have no idea who Joe Biden's going to pick as his national security advisor. Nick and I have talked about this offline many times. My only guess is that I don't think Joe Biden will be able to pass up the merit badge or the honor of choosing the first female Secretary of Defense. So my smart money is on Michelle Flournoy, which is fun. I mean, you couldn't find somebody more this is not oh great, it's a woman. This is a perfectly qualified human being, male or female. And I think that makes her an obvious pick to be able to say, I picked a highly competent, kind of centrist defense intellectual who also is a, glass ceiling breaker in the Defense Department. Beyond that, I think it has been a tribute to the message discipline of the Biden campaign that they have not let themselves get freighted down by arguments over the next Secretary of State, which is always a stupid mistake that campaigns make. So, that's where I'm going. My guess is they will be perfectly sensible institutionalists in the Biden mold. I cannot think of anybody in the Biden foreign policy orbit. I hope that, I imagine, they're going to find a place for Jake Sullivan. Fine by me. I was an opponent of the Iran deal, but, I also am not a Democrat and I don't get to pick the staff. And if you're going to be a Democrat picking staff, Jake Sullivan's a perfectly sensible pick. But I have no idea where they're going to go with that. And I think it was really wise of Biden to deprive all of us of the ability to talk about this until all the votes were counted.
Can I just interject something? There was a report in Axios earlier today by Mike Allen suggesting that there's already been some messaging from Mitch McConnell's office, assuming that the Republicans retain their majority in the Senate, essentially saying that they will be happy to work with Biden, the Biden team, on centrist appointments. And so the two names that were floated were Tony Blinken as Secretary of State and Lael Brainard as Secretary of the Treasury. But does this also raise a question, looking forward and both, and also back to you, Tatiana, given the work that you do with Gen Z and millennial voters, the extent to which people were hoping that Joe Biden would open the door to more progressives, more generational shifts, and so on. Is there going to be disappointment among some of the electorate that cast votes for Joe Biden that some of the people that he's likely to get through are going to be people that both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders ran against in 2016, right? That the more of the pre-2016 approach to foreign policy, and you see this as having much of an impact? Disappointment. Will this lead Gen Z and millennial voters to say it was useless to turn out? Who cares? Anything that you're seeing, and again, Tom, because you and Tatiana from your position, but also Tom from yours, given that you've been very interested in questions of turnout, of who votes, of both not only who votes, but who do you keep from voting, off ramps for voting, things like that. I mean, what is it that you're taking from all of this about what this is saying about the American electorate?
I'm sorry, Tatiana, did you want to?
Yeah, so just real quick, I do want to say that I think this voting cycle was very much for and against versus personality versus for and against policy. I can't tell you the number of times I heard, this is all local New York City, so I'm talking of a bubble of New York City, but I'm going to vote for Donald Trump. I don't like his character, but I appreciate the pro-life policies that he espouses. Or I am voting for Biden, even though I was for Buttigieg or Klobuchar or, Kamala. Kamala is already in there, but you know what I'm saying? It was a vote of very, very much for or against a person, not so much thinking forward to policy. And I say this even with all my research into how climate change and social justice leads people to go into the streets, for example. Yesterday, we had a lot of protests here in New York City, for example. But I don't think that's what this particular vote was for or against, not policy. That's my perspective. I don't know what you think, Tom.
Well, I'm going to be the skunk at the garden party and the grumpy old curmudgeon about Gen Z and millennial voters. Nick, you were talking about, are they going to be sorry they turned out? My question is, did they turn out? One of the things I've tried to, I'm 59. I can still say that because I don't turn 60 until next month. I'm 59. I'm a former Republican who, for years when I was a Republican, when I worked in the Senate, back in the 90s for John Hines, I used to tease my Democratic friends of saying, "Oh yes, I know you care about all these things, and you will do anything to get them except show up and vote." Going to the streets. I saw that yesterday, Tatiana. For what? What is this protest on Election Day, the day after Election Day in New York, for? To reaffirm to voters who were concerned about protests that they're going to get exactly the thing that they voted against? I mean, this is political theater. It is self-actualization. It is activism in place of I worked in state government in Massachusetts. And so I know about one-party states. I worked in state government in Massachusetts for over 2 years. You know what wins things? Showing up and grinding out the boring work of making sure, if you want social justice, make sure that the guy you want is the head of the Commerce or Labor Committee in the State House in Boise or Augusta, and not whoever the president is. The president does not control most of these things. And this frustrates the hell out of me because someone sent me a tweet the other day with some data, and I haven't been able to run down the data because we've all been a little busy, that said, hey, youth turnout was smashing records and it got to almost 50%. Like we're all celebrating youth turnout rocketing to 48 or 49%. Compare that with where middle-aged and old people vote. I've told younger voters, if you just show up, you increase your turnout by 10 points, you will run the country tomorrow. You make the voting age 15 if you wanted. But I don't see where Joe Biden needs to spend a lot of time agonizing about what 20-year-old college students whose main issue is climate change think about the next Secretary of State. That is just not, if you're advising a major politician, you say, look, these people are either going to vote for you or they're going to not turn out. They're not persuadable. They are not following, they wouldn't know the difference between Secretary of State Jane Smith and Secretary of State John Jones when it comes to, they just don't pay that close of attention consistently. And Tatiana, you're the expert on Gen Z and how they pay attention. But what we see in the electoral process is they focus intensely and then they pull back, and then they focus intensely. The people that politicians love are the people who are constantly there, election after election, donating time, showing up. And so, you know, my attitude about how will the younger generation feel about Joe Biden's picks, I don't think Joe Biden has to care about that. I certainly don't. You know, well, I'm old school, and, you know, I'm about winning elections. I'm the guy that for 4 years has been hammering the table, especially during the Democratic primaries, 270, 270. All you care about, and it looks like now we will be happy if Joe Biden gets to 290. I mean, Joe Biden might win this election at exactly 270. And I think one of the mistakes, and now I'm talking to younger and more liberal voters who are all yelling at me already. One of the mistakes I think that younger and more liberal voters made is they assumed that the national loathing of Donald Trump was so uniform and complete that this election was not only going to herald the end of Donald Trump, it was going to begin the beginning of a progressive golden age. And so they didn't have any problem with the idea that, you know, why shouldn't I vote for Pete Buttigieg? You know, why wouldn't anybody in Georgia want to vote against a gay married 40-year-old small town mayor from Indiana from a college town? Like, it doesn't occur to them that people vote on these ascriptive characteristics, as you said, Tatiana, about, I just don't like this guy. I don't like his character. You know, the idea that, look, leave Pete Buttigieg out of it. Look at Bernie Sanders. I'm going to win by turning out the youth vote and by energizing the left and running on social justice and, you know, social equity. None of it happened. Not only did it not happen, those voters didn't turn out. They didn't even turn out in their own primary. And I think some of the smartest things that Joe Biden did, Biden ignored Twitter, which I think actually is what sank the Harris campaign early on. Harris and Warren were way too online, way too Twitter focused. Twitter is a bubble within a bubble within a bubble. Biden focused on Trump and character and decency rather than wonky piles of policy recommendations. He kept a low profile while Trump was hurting himself. These were all excellent decisions that I think that frustrated other Democrats. I mean, I was talking to Democrats, and not just online, but people that were doing things like running fundraisers and who were supporting other candidates. And like, but I want Elizabeth Warren because she's going to get out there and she's going to punch Trump in the face during the debates. What did we learn from the debates? The job of a Democratic candidate when you're debating Donald Trump is to be quiet and let Donald Trump hang himself. That worked beautifully. Biden just, you know, what's the memorable line that we're going to take away from 2020? Will you shut up, man? That's it.
Well, mine is I'm speaking, actually. That's my favorite. But that I'm speaking thing, that went over well with people who like Democrats and who like Kamala Harris. And it did not go over well with a lot of centrist voters who felt like that came across as, you know, kind of in your, and you can call it misogynist, you can call it racist. You're trying to win that segment of voters. And the fact that we are sweating out the counts in Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, and Pennsylvania tells me that those things matter. The better, I think, you know, Harris, personally, I wouldn't have done that. I would have sat back, tented my fingers, pointed at him and said, let him go. Let him talk. Every time he interrupted Biden and Biden tried to talk, I was yelling at the TV, shh, 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 you know? But
I mean, I don't think I'm going to be curious to see the data on whether Harris energized anyone that wasn't already in the Biden camp. I'm very curious about that data. So I'll leave the rest, because Harris was definitely not my pick, but I don't know who would have been better. I can think of all the candidates that would have been worse, but I can't think of who would have been better. But Nick, to go back to your point about international relations, unless there's a draft, what people under 25 think about international relations almost never plays. They are not informed enough about it. It's not something that holds their interest. The American public doesn't vote on it. And until we see more evidence that I think if young people turn out in large numbers, yeah, climate change goes to the top of the agenda. But until then, I don't see it. And I think Biden's two priorities are going to be Biden's priorities are not going to be my priorities. My priorities are going to be reversing every executive order Trump made, like just in the first hour he's in office. But I think it's going to be the pandemic and the economy. And going back to your point about McConnell's already feathering McConnell loves being the Senate Majority Leader. That's what he likes more than anything in the world. McConnell has no ideology. He doesn't care about abortion. He doesn't care about race. I know he cares about those things because they make him powerful in the short term. If Biden comes forward and says, here's a whole bunch of things I can do that are going to, not hurt you and that help the country, McConnell's going to go, as long as I'm running my caucus, I don't care what you do. Because McConnell's not running for re-election again. That's the other thing. McConnell is not going to be running for re-election at like 96 years old or whatever the hell he's going to be. So.
Well, you never know, because this election has certainly taught us that
yeah.
you can be whatever age you want, apparently.
Yeah.
But I do respectfully disagree, and I do believe that the youth vote will be more important. When I see young people teaching themselves Korean to sing along with K-pop, when I see people coming out for Greta Thunberg last year when we could organize in crowds and strikes, and I was down there with them.
Greta Thunberg. Sudden shooting pain in my temples.
We will maybe table that to our next discussion. Well, thank you.
But all right, but let me be the voice of annoying hardball politics. This is all very romantic and sounds great, and they're learning Korean and they're coming out for Greta Thunberg. I only have one question. Did they vote? If the answer is yes, great. Now I care more about what they thought. Personally, I think Greta Thunberg probably cost more votes than she generated, because I think the Greta Thunberg phenomenon, was, frankly, if I'd have been a Republican donor, I might have been funding that. Because again, in an election where you are trying to turn people off to Donald Trump, you don't want to have somebody who irritates those same centrist voters. And the fact that this election was so close tells me the Democrats made a lot of these mistakes. But take Thunberg off the table. All I have is a question for you. These young people that, are so engaged and so interested in, doing all this stuff, all I care about is whether they voted. If they voted, great. If they didn't, they don't exist in the electoral process. They just don't. And I have had this argument with youth about youth turnout for really, but I have to tell you, I was a college student who thought the voting age should be 21 because I knew my fellow college students. I don't think people are really, I think, having people vote at 18 years old is probably not a great idea, but I don't think it matters that much because the turnout numbers, particularly in off-year elections, and let me just foot stomp this again, turning out every 4 years at about 40 to 50% of the vote is not that important. It is turning out every 2 years in local and state elections. And young people resolutely refuse to do this. When you've got primaries in Seattle where 14%, or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, what was the turnout in New York 14 that year? 17%? in a primary? 17%? Really? At that point, when you're telling me about the importance of the youth vote, my answer is the same about any other vote in America. If they show up, politicians will pay attention to them. If they don't show up, then it's just a lot of noise and banners and TV and marching. And in the real world of politics, those guys just, they don't care. Because they don't have to. And I don't say that normatively or as a good thing. I'm saying as an empirical matter, if you don't show up, you don't get a place.
I'm gonna love to see these numbers, because I think they might inspire you.
I hope so. I want to believe. I mean, I have been going on Twitter, which is mostly young, skews young and liberal, and I'm saying, I dare you, prove me wrong. Make a fool of me. Come out and I was telling young people, vote just to spite Tom, the curmudgeonly old guy. But it is it has been a shock to me. I haven't missed an election since I was 18 years old. I just haven't. And that includes primaries. I mean, I vote in everything. And I have always been shocked that young people just don't bother. But because it's not interesting and it's not fun and it doesn't feel like it's having an immediate impact. And maybe I went to work in state government in Massachusetts while I was in college. I went from being an intern to a salaried legislative aide for the chairman of a committee. And I then wrote I came back in graduate school for a while and wrote an actual major report that got all kinds of changed things in Massachusetts, all that stuff. And I was all done with that experience by the time I was 24 years old. So that had a huge impact on me, to realize how much gets done at that level of government and how much that level of government is controlled by old people who care, who show up.
Well,
so do it to spite me, young people.
And I am actually inspired by the changes that I've seen in my local neighborhood. And I hope that New York is not a bubble. And I hope that we're going to hear some news soon from Nevada, Georgia, Pennsylvania. Thank you so much for joining us today, Tom. Nick, any last thoughts?
I just think to echo what we've been discussing here, which is politics is a long, hard slog, and getting involved and not tuning out the day after. And this is why we hope podcasts like the Doorstep are part of that process of making sure that people are informed and take their obligation to vote and be a part of the process seriously, because that's what makes the change happen. So
can I add a point about that, Nick, because it's something you and I have said so many times to people who are listening to this and wondering why I'm just railing about this. When students in particular ask me about this, I tell them politics is a noble vocation, political service, public service, not elected politics, because that's a acquired taste for very few people, but it's boring. Politics is boring, and it ought to be. Even working in national security and international relations is like police work. Like my dad and my brother were both cops. And the old story about police work is hours of boredom punctuated by moments of terror. That's what politics should be like, is boring and routine. And if you really want to have an impact, you've got to commit to the just the slog of the stuff that isn't fun. And you've got to pay attention to it when everybody else has stopped paying attention to it. That's when you have a really outsized impact on politics, is when you're still the person paying attention to what's going on, when everyone else has gone on with their lives 3 days after the election. And I really want to encourage people who want to have a political impact. You have to stay with it. You have to understand that it's going to be a grind, and that in the end, the cumulative effect is that you really can have a tremendous impact on politics, but you got to keep showing up.
I think that is a great way to end episode 4. And I'm going to go back to my nail biting and eating donuts.
Thank you, Tom. We really appreciate it.
Thank you both for having me.
Thanks for listening to The Doorstep. sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. For more, go to carnegiecouncil.org. Stay healthy and safe.